The Cannery Boat. By Takiji Kobayashi. Hey, we're going to hell. Two men leaned against the deck railing, gazing at the city of Hakodate, which stretched out like a snail on tiptoe, embracing the sea. One fisherman spat out his cigarette but along with a wad of saliva. The cigarette, as if mocking them, tumbled end over end, falling down the high side of the ship. The man reeked of alcohol. There were steamships with wide, red bellies, others listing heavily to one side as if a sleeve were caught in the sea during loading, yellow, thick smokestacks, buoys large as bells, launches weaving busily between ships like bedbugs, and the cold, restless waves, a peculiar tapestry afloat with oil slicks, breadcrumbs, and rotting fruit. The wind carried the choking smell of coal as smoke drifted just above the waves. The clatter of a winch occasionally echoed directly across the water. Just ahead of the Hako Maru, their cannery boat, a peeling painted sailing ship was lowering its anchor chain from a hole in its bow that resembled a bull's nostril. On the deck, two foreigners with sailor pipes paced back and forth like automatons, retracing their steps again and again. It looked like a Russian ship, almost certainly a surveillance vessel keeping an eye on the Japanese cannery boats. I ain't got a single penny left. Damn it. He shifted closer and took the other fisherman's hand, pulling it towards his waist. He pressed it against something small and box-like in the pocket of his corduroy trousers beneath his short coat. The other man silently looked at the fisherman's face. He chuckled. Hanafuda cards, he said. On the boat deck, the captain, looking like a shogun, strolled around smoking. The smoke he exhaled bent sharply at his nostrils and dissipated. A crewman in wooden-soled sandals shuffled busily in and out of the forward cabins, carrying a food pail. The preparations were complete, they were ready to depart. Looking down into the hatch where the deckhands were, they could see them bustling about on the dimly lit bunks below, like birds poking their heads out of a nest. They were all boys of 14 or 15. Where are you from? Times town. They were all the same, kids from the slums of Hakodate. They formed a distinct group. What about that bunk over there? Nanbu. And that one? Akita. They were divided by prefecture. Where in Akita? One boy, with a runny, pus-like nose and red-rimmed eyes, answered, Akita. Farmer. Yeah. The air was thick and heavy with the sour smell of rotting fruit. The stench of something akin to excrement mingled with it, likely from the room next door where dozens of barrels of pickles were stored. I'll cuddle up with this kid tonight, one of the fishermen said with a coarse laugh. In a dimly lit corner, a woman who seemed to be a mother, wearing a short coat, baggy trousers, and a triangularly folded furoshiki cloth on her head, was peeling an apple and feeding it to a child lying on his stomach on a bunk. As she watched the child eat, she ate the peel she had just spiraled off. She murmured something, and repeatedly unfolded and refolded a small furoshiki bundle beside the child. There were 7 or 8 other mothers like her. The children from inland, who had no one to see them off, occasionally glanced their way. A woman, her hair and clothes covered in cement dust, was distributing a couple of caramels to each of the children around her. Be good to my Kenji and work hard with him, okay, she said. Her hands were rough and gnarled, unnaturally large like tree roots. There were mothers wiping their children's noses, others washing their faces with hand towels, still others whispering to them. Your boy's got a good build, doesn't he? It was a conversation between mothers. Yeah, well, mine's awfully weak. I worry about him, but what can you do? It's the same everywhere, isn't it? The two fishermen emerged from the hatch onto the deck, relieved. They fell silent, their faces sullen, and returned to their own nest, a trapezoidal space farther forward, beyond the deckhands' quarters. Every time the anchor was raised or lowered, they were tossed about like concrete in a mixer, bumping into each other in the dim light. The fishermen sprawled like pigs, and the air was thick with the same stench as a pigsty, a smell that made you want to gag. Stinks. Yeah, that's us. Guess we got a smell like we're about to rot. A fisherman with a red, mortar-like head poured sake directly from a one-show bottle into a chipped teacup and drank it while munching on dried squid. Next to him, another fisherman lay on his back, eating an apple and reading a tattered story magazine. 4 men had been drinking in a circle, and one of them, who hadn't had enough, barged in. That's right. 4 months at sea. I'm thinking I can't take this anymore. A powerfully built man said this, narrowing his eyes and occasionally licking his thick lower lip, a habit. And, look at my wallet. He held up a flat, thin purse, the color of dried persimmons. That old geezer, skinny as he is, he sure was good. Hey, stop it, stop it. Yeah, all right. The other man chuckled. Look, impressive, ain't it? Huh. One of them, with drunken eyes fixed on the bunk below, across the aisle, said with a jerk of his chin. A fisherman was handing money to his wife. Look, see. They were counting the crumpled bills and silver coins laid out on a small box. The man was licking his pencil as he wrote something in a small notebook. Look. See. I got a wife and kids too, why no, the fisherman who'd been talking about the old man suddenly said, sounding angry. On a bunk a little further away, a young fisherman with a puffy, hung-over face and long hair only in the front, was saying loudly, I was thinking I wouldn't come back to sea this time. But, he continued, those labor recruiters dragged me around, left me penniless. Now I'm gonna be stuck here again, working myself to death. Another man, who seemed to be from the same place, with his back to them, whispered something to him. A man with a clubfoot appeared at the hatch entrance, carrying a large, old-fashioned drawstring bag. He came down the ladder, stood on the floor, and looked around. Finding an empty space, he climbed onto a bunk. Good day, he said, bowing his head to the man next to him. His face was dark and oily, as if stained with something. Could I join you folks? As they later learned, this man had worked as a miner in the Abari coal mines for 7 years until the recent gas explosion, which he had narrowly escaped, not his first close call. He had suddenly been seized with fear and left the mines. During the explosion, he had been pushing a coal car in the same shaft. It happened just as he'd loaded the car full of coal and was pushing it to another worker's station. He thought 100 magnesium flares had ignited right in front of him. And then, in the next fraction of a second, he felt himself flung somewhere like a piece of paper. Several coal cars, propelled by the force of the gas, flew past him, lighter than empty matchboxes. Then, he knew nothing. He didn't know how much time had passed when he opened his eyes at the sound of his own moaning. The foreman and supervisors were building a wall in the tunnel to contain the explosion. From behind that wall, he clearly heard the cries for help of the trapped miners, cries that seemed to be seared into his heart, never to be forgotten. He suddenly stood up and, as if mad, rushed into the group, shouting, No. He had helped build such walls before, and at the time, he had felt nothing. You idiot. Don't spread the fire here. We'll all be screwed. But he could tell the voices were getting fainter and fainter. Driven by who knows what, he began running frantically down the tunnel, waving his arms and yelling. He stumbled repeatedly, hitting his forehead on the tunnel supports. He was covered in mud and blood. He tripped over a railroad tie and was thrown onto the rails like a rag doll, losing consciousness again. Listening to this story, the young fisherman said, Well, it's not much different here. The miner fixed his gaze, a dull, yellowish stare peculiar to miners, on the fisherman and remained silent. Among the fishermen farmers from Akita, Amori, and Iwate, some sat cross-legged, hands tucked between their thighs, looking glum, others hugged their knees, leaning against pillars, listening intently to the others drinking and chatting. These were men who had toiled in the fields from before dawn, yet couldn't make ends meet, and were driven from their land. Leaving behind their eldest sons and still unable to survive, the women became factory workers, and the second and third sons had to find work elsewhere. Like beans scooped from a pot, those deemed surplus were relentlessly driven from the land and into the cities. They all planned to save money and return home. However, once they stepped ashore after a season's work, they floundered in Hakodate or Otaru like birds caught in birdlime. Then, as easily as that, they found themselves stripped bare, back where they started. They couldn't go home. To survive the harsh Hokkaido winter, they had to sell their bodies for next to nothing. They repeated this cycle countless times, and like incorrigible children, they blithely did the same thing again the following year. A peddler woman with a basket of sweets, a medicine vendor, and a merchant with daily necessities entered. They spread out their wares in a space cleared in the middle, like an island. The men leaned out from their bunks, teasing and joking. Wanna buy some sweets? Come on, they're good. Hey, "Stop it," the peddler woman shrieked, jumping up. "Don't touch my ass, you jerk." The man, his mouth full of sweets, embarrassed by the attention, guffawed. "This gal's cute," a drunk returning from the lavatory, steadying himself against the wall, said as he pinched the peddler woman's plump, reddish-black cheek. "What do you want? Don't be mad. I'm gonna cuddle up with this gal tonight." He made a silly face at the woman, and everyone laughed. "Hey, mon Dieu, someone shouted from a far corner. "Yes." A clear, ringing female voice, unusual in this place, answered. How many? How many? Two'd be too much for YA, wouldn't it? Mon Dieu, mon Dieu." A sudden burst of laughter erupted. "Hey, I heard that Takeda dragged that peddler woman into a secluded spot the other day and forced himself on her. Funny, ain't it? No matter what he did, she wouldn't give in. It was a young, drunk man. She was wearing Sarumata, padded underpants, they say. Takeda ripped em right off, but she still had more underneath, they say. 3 pairs, she was wearing." The man hunched his shoulders and started laughing. That man worked in a rubber boot factory during the winter. When he lost his job in the spring, he went to Kamchatka to earn some money. Both jobs were seasonal, most jobs in Hokkaido were, and when there was night work, it was continuous. He used to say, "I'd be grateful to live just 3 more years." His skin was the dull color of cheap rubber. Among the fishermen were some who had been sold to labor contractors for land reclamation in the remote areas of Hokkaido or for railroad construction, some who were wandering day laborers, and some who were content with just drinking sake and nothing else. Honest farmers, naive as newborns, chosen as respectable village heads in Amori, were also among them. This motley crew was exactly what the employers wanted. The Hakodate labor union was desperately trying to plant organizers among the Cannery Boat crews and the Kamchatka fishermen, collaborating with unions in Amori and Akita. The employers were most afraid of this. Waiters in short, starched white jackets bustled back and forth to the stern saloon, carrying glasses of beer, fruit, and liquor. In the saloon were the company's bigwigs, the captain, the supervisor, the naval officer from the destroyer in charge of security in Kamchatka, the head of the water police, and a briefcase from the Seamen's Union. "Damn, those guys are guzzling like there's no tomorrow," a waiter grumbled. An electric light, the shape of a sea cucumber, was turned on in the fisherman's hole. The air, thick with cigarette smoke and body odor, was foul, turning the whole space into a shithole. The men lying on their bunks in the partitioned sleeping quarters wriggled like maggots. Led by the fishing supervisor, the captain, the factory representative, and the bosun descended into the hatch. The captain, conscious of his upturned mustache, kept smoothing his upper lip with a handkerchief. The passageway was littered with apple and banana peels, soggy cigarette butts, straw sandals, and rice grains clinging to scraps of seaweed. It was like a stagnant ditch. The supervisor, looking at the mess, spat on the floor without hesitation. They all looked flushed, apparently having been drinking. "I'm gonna lay down the law," the supervisor, a burly man built like a construction foreman, said, placing one foot on the partition between bunks and picking his teeth with a toothpick. He occasionally spat out bits of food stuck between his teeth. Some of you already know this, but it goes without saying that this Cannery Boat operation ain't just some company's money-making scheme. It's a major international issue. It's a showdown between us, the people of the Empire of Japan, and those damn Russians. And if we were to lose, which should never happen, any Japanese man worth his salt should commit harakiri and throw himself into the Kamchatka Sea. We might be smaller, but we ain't gonna lose to those hairy Russians. Our Kamchatka fishing operation, with its canned crab, salmon, and trout, holds a superior position internationally, and it also carries a significant responsibility towards Japan's pressing population and food problems. You guys probably don't understand what I'm saying, but the point is, we gotta know we're risking our lives, crossing the rough seas of the North, for the great mission of the Empire of Japan. That's why our warships are always there to protect us. And if anyone tries to pull some crap, imitating those damn Russians, they're betraying the Empire of Japan. I'm sure this won't happen, but keep that in mind. The supervisor sneezed repeatedly, sobering up. The drunk naval officer, walking with the jerky movements of a wind-up toy, descended the gangplank to board the waiting launch. Sailors, struggling to support their stone-drunk captain, practically carried him like a sack of potatoes. The captain's flailing arms and legs and incoherent shouting made it difficult for the sailors, and one of them received a face full of spit. "He talks big on deck, but look at him now," one sailor muttered, looking at the captain after they had finally gotten him settled in the launch. He was unhooking the rope from the gangplank landing. "Should we just dump him?" The two sailors held their breath for a moment, then burst out laughing. Point 2. The Shukutsu lighthouse flashed intermittently, its light visible far off to the right, through the grey sea fog. As it rotated, it cast a mysterious, long, silvery beam that stretched for miles across the sea around Rumoi. A fine, drizzling rain began to fall. The fishermen and deckhands had to work with numb hands, like crab claws, occasionally shoving them into their pockets or cupping them around their mouths to blow warm air. The rain fell incessantly, like strands of natto, onto the opaque, grey sea. As they approached Wakkanai, the rain turned to drops, and swells appeared on the broad surface of the sea, rippling like flags in the wind, growing choppy and restless. The wind howled ominously through the masts. Somewhere in the ship, something creaked constantly, as if rivets were loosening. As they entered the Sawyer Strait, the nearly 3,000-ton ship began to buck and shudder like someone with hiccups. It would be lifted by some immense force, hovering momentarily in the air, then plunging back down with a thud. Each time, they felt the same unpleasant, ticklish sensation in their gut as when descending in an elevator. The deckhands, pale and seasick, with wide, staring eyes, retched and groaned through the round portholes, blurred by sea spray. They could glimpse the hard lines of Sakhaline's snow-capped mountains. But they were quickly obscured by waves that swelled like alpine glacier outside the glass, forming deep, chilling valleys. As the waves drew closer, they crashed against the portholes, shattering and foaming. Then, they flowed past the glass like a panorama, receding into the distance. The ship occasionally shuddered like a child shivering. They heard the clatter of objects falling from the bunks, the groaning of strained metal, and the thud of waves against the ship's side. All the while, the engine's throbbing resonated directly through various parts of the ship, accompanied by a slight vibration. Sometimes, when riding the crest of a wave, the propeller would race, its blades slapping the surface of the water. The wind grew stronger. The two masts bent like fishing rods, whistling in the wind. Waves, large enough to stride over logs, crashed over the ship's side, sweeping across the deck like a marauding gang before pouring back into the sea. For an instant, the scuppers became waterfalls. Sometimes, the ship rode the monstrous slope of a towering wave, looking like a toy boat. Then, it would plunge into the trough, as if about to sink. But another wave would immediately swell up from the depths, crashing against the ship's side with a deafening boom. As they entered the Sea of Okhotsk, the water became distinctly grayer. The cold pierced through their clothes, and the deckhands worked with bluish lips. The colder it got, the more fiercely a fine, dry snow blew, stinging their faces and hands like tiny glass shards. After each wave washed over the deck, the water froze instantly, making it treacherously slippery. They had to string ropes across the deck and cling to them like diapers while they worked. The supervisor, brandishing a club like a salmon killer, yelled and cursed. The other Cannery boats that had left Hakodate with them had vanished. But sometimes, when they crested a wave, they could see two masts far off in the distance, swaying like a drowning man waving his arms. A plume of smoke, thin as cigarette smoke, trailed from the ship, whipped and torn by the wind. From amid the roaring waves and the howling wind, they could faintly hear the distant blasts of the other ship's whistle. But the next moment, their own ship would plummet into the trough of a wave. The Cannery boat carried 8 Kawasaki boats on deck. The crew and fishermen had to risk their lives to secure these boats, lest they be ripped away by the waves, which seemed to be baring their white teeth like thousands of sharks. "What's a few of you guys? But if we lose a single Kawasaki, we're screwed," the supervisor said clearly in Japanese. The Sea of Okhotsk seemed to be lying in wait for them, snarling like a ravenous lion. The ship seemed weaker than a rabbit. The blizzard that filled the sky looked like a huge white flag waving in the wind. Night was approaching, but the storm showed no signs of abating. When work was over, the men crawled back into their shithole. Their hands and feet were numb with cold, feeling like they were barely attached to their bodies. Like silkworms, they retreated into their bunks, lying motionless, clinging to the iron supports. The ship bucked like a horse trying to shake off clinging horseflies. The fishermen stared blankly at the soot-stained, yellowing white paint of the ceiling or at the dark blue portholes, almost completely submerged in the sea. Some had their mouths half open, their faces vacant. No one was thinking. A vague, unsettling feeling kept them sullenly silent. One man was gulping whiskey straight from the bottle. In the dim, yellowish light, the corner of the bottle glinted. Clink, clatter. A few empty whiskey bottles were hurled from bunks into the aisle, bouncing off the iron supports. The men turned their heads, following the bottles with their eyes. Someone in a corner grumbled angrily. His words, fragmented by the storm, sounded like gibberish. Leaving Japan? Someone murmured, wiping a porthole with his elbow. The stove in the shithole was smoldering. The men inside, as if mistaken for salmon or trout and tossed into a refrigerator, shivered. Waves washed over the canvas-covered hatch, sending a terrible roar through the iron walls of the shithole, like the inside of a drum. From time to time, a bunk would lurch violently, as if grabbed by a strong man's shoulder. The ship was now like a dying whale, thrashing in the raging waves. "Chow!" the cook yelled, poking his head and shoulders out the doorway, his hands cupped around his mouth. "No soup cause of the storm." "What'd you say?" "Damn salted salmon." He pulled his head back inside. The men hauled themselves up, their faces grim. They attacked their food with the single-minded ferocity of prisoners. They placed their plates of salted salmon between their legs as they sat cross-legged and shoveled the steaming rice into their mouths, their tongues darting about. The unaccustomed warmth near their faces made their noses run, and they had to be careful not to drip into their food. The supervisor entered while they were eating. "Don't be such pigs. You can't even do your jobs properly, and you expect to stuff your faces with food." He glared at the men in the bunks, shrugged his left shoulder, and left. "What right does he have to say that?" A student, thin and pale from seasickness and exhaustion, muttered. "Asakawa. Asakawa of the crab cannery or shallow crab cannery," another quipped. "The emperor's up in the clouds, so we don't give a damn about him, but if it's Asakawa, it's a different story." From another bunk, "What's the big deal about a bowl or two of rice?" "Just punch him," a sharp voice said. "Bravo, bravo. Even more bravo if you said that to Asakawa's face." The men, still angry, couldn't help but laugh. Late at night, the supervisor, wearing a raincoat, entered the fishermen's sleeping quarters. Holding onto the bunk frames to steady himself against the ship's rolling, he shone his lantern into each man's face, roughly turning their pumpkin-like heads. Even if kicked, they wouldn't have woken up. After checking everyone, he clicked his tongue. He seemed to be considering something. Then, he headed towards the cook's quarters. The flickering light of his wide-beamed, bluish lantern illuminated parts of the cluttered bunks, long rubber boots, coats and short coats hanging from the supports, and luggage, before disappearing again. The light pooled momentarily at his feet, then cast a circular halo on the cook's door. The next morning, they discovered that one of the deckhands was missing. Remembering the brutal work from the previous day, everyone figured he must have been swept overboard by a wave. They felt uneasy. But the fishermen were so driven by the supervisors from before dawn that they didn't have a chance to talk about it amongst themselves. Who'd jump into this freezing water on purpose? "He's hiding somewhere. If I find him, I'll beat him to a pulp." The supervisor searched the ship, twirling his club like a toy. The storm had passed its peak, but when the ship plunged into an oncoming wave, the water still surged over the foredeck as if stepping over a threshold. The ship, battered by the day and night struggle, limped forward, groaning. Thin, smoke-like clouds raced across the sky, close enough to touch, brushing against the masts. The cold rain continued to fall. As the waves swelled around them, they could clearly see the streaks of rain against the sea. It was eerier than being caught in a downpour in a primeval forest. The hemp ropes were frozen stiff, like iron pipes. As the student made his way across the deck, carefully placing his feet, he met a waiter bounding up the gangplank, taking 2 steps at a time. "Hey," the waiter said, pulling the student into a sheltered corner. "I've got a good one for you." It was around 2 o'clock that morning. Waves had surged up to the boat deck and then cascaded down like a waterfall. In the darkness, the whitecaps occasionally flashed with an eerie glow. Everyone was awake due to the storm. That's when it happened. The radio operator rushed into the captain's cabin. "Captain, emergency, SOS, SOS. What ship?" "The Chikaibu Maru. She was sailing alongside us." "That piece of junk." Asakawa, wearing his raincoat, was sprawled in a chair in the corner, his legs wide apart. He tapped one foot, a mocking smile on his face. "Well, all these ships are junk, anyway." "It sounds urgent, sir." "Yeah, that's bad." The captain, about to go to the steering gear room, started to open the door without even bothering to put on his jacket. But before he could open it, Asakawa grabbed his shoulder. "Who said anything about making a detour? Who gave the order?" "The captain, of course." But taken aback, the captain just stood there, dumbfounded. He quickly regained his composure. "I did, as captain." "As captain, you say?" Asakawa blocked the captain's path, his tone condescending and mocking. "Hey, whose ship is this, anyway?" "The company's chartering it, paying for it. The only one who can give orders here is me, representing the company. You might be the captain, but you're not worth a damn. Got it? Get involved in that rescue, and we'll be delayed for a week." "No way. We're already behind schedule. Besides, the Chikaibu Maru's got more insurance than it's worth. It's a piece of junk, so we'd actually profit if it sank." The waiter thought a huge fight was about to break out. There was no way it could end there. But, surprise, the captain just stood there, frozen, as if he had swallowed a gag. The captain's orders being ignored? Impossible. But it was happening. The waiter couldn't understand it. Who needs sentimentality? This is a war between nations. Asakawa snarled, spitting on the floor. In the radio room, the receiver crackled incessantly, spitting out tiny, blue-white sparks. Everyone gathered there to monitor the situation. "Look, they keep sending. It's getting faster and faster," the operator explained to the captain and supervisor, who were peering over his shoulder. They watched, mesmerized, as the operator's fingers deftly manipulated the switches and buttons. With each roll of the ship, the wall-mounted lamp, swollen like a boil, flickered. The crashing waves against the hull and the incessant, ominous blasts of the ship's whistle, muffled by the iron door, seemed to grow closer, then recede. A long, drawn-out buzz, a shower of sparks, and then silence. Everyone's heart skipped a beat. The operator frantically adjusted the switches and fiddled with the equipment, but it was no use. The Chikaibu Maru was no longer transmitting. The operator swiveled in his chair. "She's gone," he said quietly, removing the headphones. 425 souls on board. Last message. No hope of rescue. SOS, SOS, repeated a few times, and then, nothing. Hearing this, the captain clutched his throat, gasping for air, and craned his neck. His eyes darted nervously around the room. Then, he turned towards the door, his hand covering the knot of his tie. He couldn't bear to watch. The student simply said, "So that's it, huh?" He was gripped by the story. A sense of dread washed over him, and he looked away from the sea. The ocean still heaved with enormous swells. One minute the horizon seemed to be right beneath their feet, the next they were plunged into the depths, staring at the narrow patch of sky above. Did she really sink? He muttered to himself. He couldn't shake the thought. It was unsettling to think of their own predicament. On a similar rust bucket, all the Cannery boats were dilapidated. The executives in their high-rise offices in Tokyo didn't care if workers died in the North Okhotsk Sea. When capitalism, driven by its insatiable hunger for profit, could no longer sustain itself on conventional returns, when interest rates fell and capital became excessive, it would literally do anything, go anywhere, desperately seeking new avenues for exploitation. And then there were the Cannery boats, each one promising hundreds of thousands of yen in pure profit. No wonder they were obsessed. A Cannery boat is a factory ship, not a passenger ship. Therefore, maritime laws didn't apply. Decrepit vessels, 20 years past their prime, fit only for scrapping, syphilitic patients barely afloat, were given a superficial makeover and sent to Hakodate. Hospital ships and transports, crippled during the Russo-Japanese War and abandoned like fish guts, reappeared like ghosts. If they pushed the engines too hard, pipes would burst. When pursued by Russian surveillance ships and forced to increase speed, which happened frequently, every part of the ship would groan, threatening to fall apart. The ship shuddered like a palsy patient, but none of that mattered. Because this was the time for the Empire of Japan to rise, no matter the cost. Besides, a cannery boat was essentially a factory. But factory laws didn't apply either. It was a perfect setup, a place where they could do whatever they wanted. The shrewd executives linked this venture to the good of the Empire of Japan. Mountains of money flowed into their pockets. Driving his car, the executive contemplated running for parliament to further secure his wealth. But perhaps, at that very moment, the workers of the Chikaibu Maru, thousands of miles away in the dark, northern sea, were fighting a desperate battle against the sharp, glass-like waves and the howling wind. The student pondered this as he descended the gangplank back to the shithole. This isn't someone else's problem, he muttered. At the bottom of the ladder into the shithole, a notice was posted, full of misspellings, stuck to the wall with grains of rice. Reward for finding the deckhand Miyaguchi, 2 bats, 1 hand towel. Asakawa, supervisor. 3. The drizzle continued for days. The Kamchatka coastline, softened by the mist, stretched out like a lamprey. The Hakko Maru dropped anchor 4 nautical miles offshore. They couldn't enter within 3 nautical miles, that was Russian territory, according to the rules. The nets were prepared, ready for crab fishing. Dawn broke around 2 o'clock in Kamchatka, so the fishermen, fully dressed in their thigh-high rubber boots, crawled into their bunks for a few hours of sleep. The Tokyo student, tricked by the labor recruiter, grumbled, "This wasn't what I signed up for." "Private bunks," they said. "Ha. Private bunks, all right. More like private floors." There were about 17 or 18 students. They had agreed to a 60 yen advance, but after deductions for travel expenses, lodging, blankets, bedding, and the recruiter's fee, they each arrived with a debt of 7 or 8 yen. When they realized this, they felt as though the money they thought they were holding had turned into dead leaves. Initially, the students huddled together among the fishermen like lost souls surrounded by demons. By the 4th day after leaving Hakodate, the students were all feeling ill from the constant diet of meager meals and the same watery soup. They lay in their bunks, knees drawn up, pressing each other's shins with their fingers. With each press, their spirits rose and fell, depending on whether the indentation remained. A few of them found that their shins had become numb, tingling like they had touched a weak electric current. They hung their legs over the edge of the bunks and karate-chopped their kneecaps to see if their feet would jerk. To make matters worse, they hadn't had a bowel movement in days. One student went to the ship's doctor for a laxative. He returned looking pale with agitation. He said they don't have such fancy medicine. "That's right. What do you expect from a ship's doctor?" an old fisherman commented. "All doctors are the same. The company doctor at the mine was just like that," said the minor fisherman. While everyone was lying around, the supervisor entered. "Everyone asleep. Listen up. We just got a wireless message that the Chikaibu Maru has sunk. No details on survivors yet." He sneered and spat, a habit of his. The student immediately recalled what he'd heard from the waiter. He thought, this guy can talk about the lives of 400 or 500 workers, whom he practically murdered, with a straight face. He's not even fit to be thrown into the sea. Everyone stirred and started talking amongst themselves. Asakawa, after delivering his news, shrugged his left shoulder and left. 2 days earlier, the missing deckhand had been caught emerging from the boiler room. He'd been hiding for 2 days but, driven by hunger, couldn't take it anymore. He was caught by a middle-aged fisherman. A young fisherman was furious and wanted to beat up the older fisherman for turning him in. "Shut up, you punk. You've never smoked a cigarette in your life, so how would you know what it tastes like?" The fisherman, who had received 2 bats as a reward, drank contentedly. The deckhand was stripped to his shirt by the supervisor and locked in one of the 2 lavatories. At first, everyone avoided using that lavatory. The sound of his cries from inside was unbearable. On the 2nd day, his voice grew hoarse and weak. The cries became less frequent. Later that day, after work, a fisherman, worried, went to check on him, but the pounding on the door from inside had stopped. There was no response to his calls. Late that night, Miyaguchi's body was carried out. He was found lying face down, his head resting on a box of toilet paper, one hand clutching his groin. His lips were a distinct shade of blue, the clear mark of death. It was a cold morning, still dark, though it was nearly 3 o'clock. The men got up, hunched against the cold, their numb hands shoved deep in their pockets. The supervisor made his rounds, rousing everyone from the fishermen's and deckhands' quarters, the engine room, and the stokehold. Regardless of whether they were sick or had colds, there was no wind, but even working on deck, their hands and feet became numb. The bosun was herding a group of 14 or 15 deckhands towards the factory, cursing loudly. He carried a bamboo stick with a leather strap at the end. It was designed so that he could beat slackers in the factory from across the machinery. He was kicking Miyaguchi this morning, trying to make him work, even though he was just pulled out of the lavatory last night. A frail deckhand, who was close to the student, reported, keeping a wary eye on the bosun. He wouldn't move, so he finally gave up, I guess. Just then, the supervisor shoved a shivering deckhand into the factory. The deckhand had caught a cold after being forced to work in the rain, which had aggravated his pleurisy. He shivered constantly, even when it wasn't cold. His brow was furrowed with wrinkles unusual for someone so young, his pale lips were twisted, and his eyes had the feverish intensity of someone suffering from malnutrition. He had been caught wandering around the boiler room, seeking warmth. The fishermen, lowering the Kawasaki boats with the winch for the day's fishing, watched the two men in silence. A fisherman in his 40s, unable to bear the sight, turned away, shaking his head in disgust. "We ain't paying you good money so you can catch colds or sleep in. Don't just stand there gawking. Get to work." The supervisor banged his club on the deck. "You wouldn't see this in a prison, even if it was a bad one. No way. How could such a thing even happen?" The winch rattled as it started up. The Kawasaki boats, swaying, began to descend one by one. Sailors and stokers, also driven relentlessly, scurried across the slippery deck. The supervisor strutted among them like a rooster with its comb raised. During a break in the work, the student sat down in the lee of some cargo to escape the wind. The minor fisherman came around the corner, cupping his hands around his mouth, blowing warm air. "This is a matter of life and death." The words, bursting forth with genuine feeling, struck the student. "Just like in the mines, you gotta risk your life just to survive. Gas is scary, but so are the waves." In the afternoon, the sky began to change. A thin sea fog spread, so faint that one could almost deny its presence. The waves became choppy, rising and falling in countless triangles. The wind suddenly picked up, whistling through the masts. The edges of the tarpaulins covering the cargo flapped against the deck. "Rabbits are flying. Rabbits," someone shouted, running across the starboard deck. The wind snatched his words, making them sound like a meaningless cry. The sea was now covered with white-capped triangular waves, like countless rabbits leaping across a vast plain. This was the precursor to a Kamchatka squall. The current suddenly picked up, and the ship began to drift sideways. The Kamchatka coastline, which had been on the starboard side, was now, inexplicably, on the port side. The fishermen and sailors who had remained on board grew frantic. The ship's whistle blared overhead. The men stopped and looked up. The thick, bucket-like smokestack, jutting out diagonally behind them, seemed surprisingly large from below, swaying precariously. The whistle, perched on top like a German helmet, sounded mournful in the howling wind. The Kawasaki boats, scattered far from the mothership, relied on this incessant whistle to guide them back through the storm. At the entrance to the dimly lit engine room, fishermen and sailors were huddled together, agitated. Flickering beams of light escaped from above, momentarily illuminating their excited faces. "What's going on?" The miner pushed his way into the group. "We're gonna kill that bastard Asakawa." They were seething with rage. Early that morning, the supervisor had received a squall warning from the XX Maru, anchored about 10 miles away. The message had even urged him to recall the Kawasaki boats immediately. "If we panicked every time there was a squall, we wouldn't get any work done." All the way out here in Kamchatka, Asakawa had reportedly said to the radio operator. The first fisherman who heard this had lashed out at the radio operator as if he were Asakawa himself. "Does he think human lives are worthless?" "Human lives? Yeah. But Asakawa doesn't even consider you human." The fisherman opened his mouth to retort but stammered, his face turning crimson. He then rushed to tell the others, which is why they were now gathered here. The men stood silently, their faces grim, a simmering rage building inside them. A deckhand, whose father was out on a Kawasaki boat, paced nervously outside the circle of fishermen. The ship's whistle continued to blare. Each blast twisted the fishermen's guts. Near dusk, a shout came from the bridge. The men below scrambled up the gangplank, taking 2 steps at a time. 2 Kawasaki boats were approaching. They were lashed together with ropes. They were close, yet the huge waves tossed them and the mothership about like dice, making it difficult for them to approach. Great swells rose between them, causing them to roll violently. They were so close, yet so far. It was agonizing. Ropes were thrown from the deck but fell short, splashing uselessly into the sea. The ropes were pulled back, snaking through the water. This was repeated several times. The men on the Hako Maru shouted encouragements, but there was no response. The fishermen's faces were frozen masks, their eyes fixed, unblinking. The scene, with its unbearable intensity, etched itself into their minds. Another rope was thrown. It uncoiled, snaking through the air like an eel. Then, as its end reached out, it struck a fisherman who was reaching for it, knocking him sideways. "Ah!" everyone cried. The fisherman, caught off guard, was knocked flat. But he held on. The rope tightened, dripping seawater, stretched taut. The fishermen on the Hako Maru breathed a collective sigh of relief. The ship's whistle continued its mournful wail, rising and falling with the wind. By dusk, all but 2 of the Kawasaki boats had returned. Every fisherman, upon stepping onto the deck of the Hako Maru, looked as if he were about to collapse. One boat had taken on so much water that they had to drop anchor and transfer the fishermen to another Kawasaki. The other boat, along with its crew, was missing. The supervisor was furious. He paced back and forth between the deck and the fishermen's quarters. Each time he appeared, the men watched him in silence, their eyes filled with burning hatred. The next day, the Hako Maru set out to search for the missing Kawasaki boat, while also continuing the crab fishing. "A few men are nothing, but a Kawasaki boat is valuable," was the reasoning from early morning. The engine room was a hive of activity. The vibration of the rising anchor tossed the fishermen around in their bunks, located next to the anchor chain locker. Rust flaked off the side plating. The Hako Maru searched as far north as 51 degrees 5 minutes north latitude, the last reported position of the missing Kawasaki boat. Shards of broken ice drifted among the gentle swells, appearing and disappearing like living creatures. In some places, these shards formed large floes, bubbling and churning, quickly surrounding the ship. The ice emitted a steam-like vapor. A sudden chill swept over them like a blast from a fan. Every part of the ship began to creak, and ice formed on the wet deck and railings. The hull glistened with frost, as if dusted with white powder. Sailors and fishermen hurried across the deck, their hands cupped over their cheeks. The ship plowed forward, leaving a long wake behind it, like a single road across a vast plain. They couldn't find the Kawasaki boat. Around 9 o'clock, someone on the bridge spotted a Kawasaki boat ahead. "Damn it, we finally found it. Damn it," the supervisor shouted, running across the deck in delight. A motorboat was launched. But it wasn't the missing boat. It was a newer model, numbered 36. It carried an iron buoy, clearly belonging to the XXX Maru. It was likely left behind to mark the XXX Maru's position. Asakawa tapped the hull of the Kawasaki boat with his fingertip. "What should we do with this?" he smirked. "Let's tow it." And so, Kawasaki boat number 36 was winched up to the Hako Maru's bridge. As it was lifted, it swayed, dripping seawater onto the deck. "Looks like it's seen some action," the supervisor muttered, watching the boat ascend. A fisherman, mending nets, watched the scene. "That thieving bastard. I wish the chain would snap and bash his head in." The supervisor, passing by, glared at the working men, his eyes like drills. He then called for the carpenter in a harsh voice. The carpenter poked his head out of the other hatch. "What is it?" The supervisor, realizing his mistake, turned around, irritated. "What is it? Idiot. Plane off the number. Plane. The carpenter looked confused. "You moron, come on." The small carpenter, tucking a saw handle into his belt and carrying a plane, followed the broad-shouldered supervisor across the deck, his gait unsteady. The number 3 was planed off, and Kawasaki boat number 36 became Kawasaki boat number 6. There we go. Perfect. Just you wait and see. Asakawa's mouth twisted into a smirk, and he let out a triumphant laugh. They couldn't find any other Kawasaki boats further north. Having salvaged number 36 and wasted valuable time, the Hako Maru began a wide, slow turn, heading back to its original position. The sky had cleared, and the air was crisp and clean. The Kamchatka mountain range stood out sharply against the horizon, gleaming like the Swiss Alps on a postcard. The missing Kawasaki boat never returned. The fishermen examined the belongings and family addresses left behind in the empty bunks, like puddles in a dried-up riverbed, compiling a list in case anything happened. It was an unpleasant task. It made them feel as if their own vulnerabilities were being exposed. They found a small package and a letter addressed to a woman with the same last name as one of the missing fishermen. They decided to send it with the supply ship to Hakodate. Among the belongings, they found a letter written in a mix of hiragana and katakana, the pencil strokes heavy and uneven. The letter was passed from one calloused hand to another. They read it haltingly, devouring every word, then shook their heads, as if they had seen something unpleasant, before passing it on. It was a letter from a child. One of the fishermen sniffled and looked up from the letter. It's Asakawa's fault. If they're dead, we'll avenge them, he said in a husky voice. He was a large man who had done all sorts of work in the remote areas of Hokkaido. In a lower voice, a young, broad-shouldered fisherman said, "We could easily take that bastard down." "Hey," the first man said. "If we weren't careful, he would have done us in two. This isn't someone else's problem." A man sitting in a corner, on his knees, biting his thumbnail and glancing upwards, nodded in agreement. "Leave it to me. When the time comes, I'll take care of that bastard." Everyone fell silent. The silent, but shared understanding. 3 days after the Hako Maru returned to its original position, the missing Kawasaki boat suddenly reappeared, as if by magic, sailing strongly. The men from the missing boat, upon returning to the shithole from the captain's cabin, were immediately surrounded by the other fishermen. They had been caught in the violent storm and lost control of the boat. They were as helpless as children caught in a riptide. They had been farthest out, and the wind had been against them. They were certain they were going to die. Fishermen were conditioned to accept death readily, but what happened next was a rare occurrence. The next morning, the Kawasaki boat, half submerged, had washed ashore on the Kamchatka coast. They had been rescued by Russians living nearby. The Russian family consisted of 4 people. For the fishermen, starved for the comfort of a home with women and children, it was an irresistible haven. The Russians were kind and went out of their way to help them. At first, the fishermen were apprehensive about the unfamiliar language and the foreigners' different hair and eye color, but they soon realized that these people were just like them. News of the shipwreck spread, and many villagers came to see them. This village was far from the Japanese fishing grounds. They stayed there for 2 days, recovering, before returning. They didn't want to come back. Who would want to return to this hell? But their story didn't end there. There was something more. It was the day they were leaving. They were gathered around the stove, getting ready, when 4 or 5 Russians entered the house, accompanied by a Chinese man. A stocky man with a large, red face and a short, bushy beard suddenly began speaking loudly, gesticulating wildly. The Kawasaki's captain waved his hands in front of his face to indicate that they didn't understand Russian. After each sentence spoken by the Russian, the Chinese man translated into Japanese. His Japanese was broken and disjointed, making it difficult to understand. "You no have money. That's right. You poor. That's right. So, you proletarian. Understand? Yes." The Russians chuckled and began pacing around the room, occasionally stopping to look at the fisherman. "Rich man, do this to you." He made a gesture of strangulation. "Rich man get bigger." He puffed out his stomach. "You always stay poor. Understand? Japan bad country. Working man, this." He grimaced and mimicked a sick person. "Not working man, this." He strutted around. The young fishermen were amused. That's right, they laughed. "Working man, this. Not working man, this." He repeated the previous gestures. "No good. Working man, this." He puffed out his chest and strutted proudly. "Not working man, this." He mimicked an elderly beggar. This good. Understand? Russia, this country. All working man. All working man, this. He strutted again. Russia no have not working man. No have sneaky man. No have strangle man. Understand? Russia not scary country. Everyone tell lie. The fishermen vaguely understood that this might be the dreaded reedization they had heard about. But if this was reedization, it seemed strangely right. More than anything, they were drawn to it. Understand, really understand. The Russians began talking amongst themselves. The Chinese man listened, then continued his halting translation. Man no work, but get money. Proletarian, always this. He made a gesture of being strangled. This no good. Proletarian, you, 1, 2, 300,000, 50,000, 100,000, all, this. He mimicked children holding hands. Strong. Okay. He flexed his arm. No lose, to anybody. Understand? Yes. Man no work, run away. He mimicked someone running away. Okay, true. Working man, proletarian, strong. He walked with a dignified air. Proletarian, number 1. Proletarian no exist, everyone no bread. Everyone die. Understand? Yes. Japan, still no good. Working man, this. He hunched over. Not working man, this. He puffed out his chest, mimicking someone knocking another person down. All no good. Working man, this. He stood up with a fierce expression, mimicked attacking and kicking someone on the ground. Not working man, this. He mimicked running away. Japan, all working man, good country. Proletarian country. Understand? Yes, understand. A young fisherman, caught up in the excitement, grabbed the Chinese man's hand. We'll do it, we'll definitely do it. The captain thought this was reedization. He thought, they're making them do terrible things. This is how Russia is tricking Japan. When the Russians finished, they cheered and shook the fishermen's hands vigorously. They embraced them, rubbing their rough cheeks against theirs. The bewildered Japanese, stiffening their necks, didn't know what to do back on the Hakko Maru. The fishermen kept glancing at the entrance to the shithole, urging the returnees to continue their story. They described the Russians they had met, and every detail was absorbed like ink on blotting paper. Hey, that's enough, the captain said, nudging the young fisherman who was excitedly recounting the story. He saw how captivated the others were, and he didn't like it. Point 4. A soft mist hung in the air. It had been raining until the previous day. The mist, like a veil, softened the harsh, mechanical outlines of the ventilation pipes, the smokestack, the winch arm, the hanging Kawasaki boats, and the deck railings, giving them an unusual air of familiarity. A soft, warm breeze caressed their cheeks. Such nights were rare near the stern hatch. The smell of crab innards hung heavy in the air. 2 figures of unequal height stood among the stacks of nets. A fisherman, suffering from heart problems caused by overwork, his face pale and swollen, couldn't sleep because of the pounding in his chest. He had come up on deck, leaning against the railing, gazing blankly at the viscous, shimmering sea. In his condition, the supervisor would work him to death. But the thought of dying here, in this faraway place, without ever setting foot on land, was too depressing. He was lost in thought. That's when he noticed someone between the nets. He heard the occasional crunching of crab shells underfoot. Then, hushed voices. As his eyes adjusted to the darkness, he saw a fisherman talking to a young deckhand. He couldn't hear what they were saying. The deckhand, with his back to him, turned around occasionally, as if sulking. The fisherman turned with him. This went on for a while. Suddenly, the fisherman raised his voice, then quickly lowered it, speaking rapidly. He grabbed the deckhand and pulled him close. A fight, the observing fisherman thought. He heard a muffled "mfh," as if the deckhand's mouth was covered. Then, they were still. At that moment, the deckhand's legs, stark naked below the waist, rose into the soft mist like candles. The deckhand crouched down, and the fisherman, like a toad, covered him. It all happened so quickly, a brief, choking moment. The observing fisherman quickly looked away, a wave of nausea and excitement washing over him, the fishermen were becoming increasingly tormented by their pent-up sexual frustration. For 4-5 months, these robust men had been unnaturally deprived of women. At night, conversations invariably turned to prostitutes in Hakodate or to crude descriptions of female genitalia. A single pornographic picture, its surface worn smooth, was passed around endlessly. Spread your legs. Turn this way. Moisten your lips. Entwine your legs. Focus your mind. Truly, this job is a hard one. Someone sang. The song, like water absorbed by a sponge, was instantly memorized by everyone. They sang it at every opportunity. And after singing it, they would shout, "Damn it!" Their eyes gleaming, unable to sleep, the fishermen tossed and turned in their bunks. "Damn it, I can't take it. I can't sleep. My dick's hard. What should I do?" Finally, one fisherman sat up, naked, clutching his erect penis. The sight of this large man's nakedness was disturbing, almost horrifying. The students, terrified, watched from the corners of their eyes. Several men had wet dreams. Some, unable to bear it any longer, resorted to masturbation when no one was looking. In the corners of the bunks, stained loincloths and fundoshi were rolled up, damp and reeking of semen. The students sometimes stepped on them in disgust, as if they were excrement. Then, the night visits to the deckhands' quarters began. A fisherman would slip out of the hatch, 2 or 3 bats exchanged for caramels and tucked into his pocket. When the cook opened the door to the storage room, which reeked of the lavatory and stored barrels of pickles, a voice suddenly barked from the dark, musty interior, like a slap in the face. "Close the door. If you come in now, I'll kill you. Times. Use code with caution." The radio operator listened to the messages exchanged between the other ships and reported their catches to the supervisor. It became clear that their ship was lagging behind. The supervisor grew anxious. This anxiety was then redirected, amplified, towards the fishermen and deckhands. As always, they were the ultimate scapegoats. The supervisor and the bosun deliberately created competition between the crew and the fishermen and deckhands. Even though they were all doing the same crab processing work, if the fishermen and deckhands fell behind the crew, even though it wasn't their own profits at stake, they would feel resentment. The supervisor was pleased with his strategy. One day one team would be ahead, the next day the other. They were driven to work harder and harder, their output increasing by 50 to 60% compared to previous days. But after 5 or 6 days, both groups would become exhausted, their productivity plummeting. They would slump over their work, their heads drooping. The supervisor, without a word, would strike them. Caught off guard, they would cry out in surprise. They worked in silence, like enemies or people who had forgotten how to speak. They had no energy left for even the simplest complaints. The supervisor then started offering prizes to the winning team. The smoldering embers were fanned into flames again. "It's just a small token," the supervisor said to the captain, as they drank beer in the captain's cabin. The captain, his plump hands dimpled like a woman's, tapped the edge of the table with his finger, a vacuous smile on his face. He found the supervisor's constant presence irritating. He fantasized about the fisherman rising up and throwing the man overboard. In addition to the prizes, the supervisor posted a notice announcing that the least productive worker would be branded. A metal rod would be heated red-hot and pressed against their skin. The men worked relentlessly, pursued by the inescapable threat of the branding iron, like their own shadows. Productivity soared. The supervisor knew the limits of the human body better than the men themselves. After work, as they collapsed onto their bunks like logs, they would groan involuntarily. One student recalled the hell depicted in paintings he had seen as a child, when his grandmother took him to a dimly lit temple. It was just like this, he thought. Back then, the images had evoked in his young mind the sight of giant snakes slithering through a swamp. It was exactly the same. Exhaustion kept them awake. Late at night, the unnerving sound of teeth grinding against each other, like nails scratching a glass pane, would echo through the shithole, along with sleep-talking and sudden, delirious cries. Lying awake, they would sometimes whisper to themselves, "I'm still alive," surprisingly. Still alive. They addressed these words to their own bodies. The students were suffering the most. Dostoevsky's House of the Dead. "Compared to this, that's nothing," one student said. He was so constipated that he couldn't sleep without tightly wrapping a towel around his head. "You're telling me," his bunkmate said, sipping his whiskey like medicine, savoring each drop. "This is a major operation, you know. Developing resources in uncharted territory is a big deal. This Cannery Boat operation has improved a lot, they say. In the early days, they couldn't predict the weather or the currents, and they didn't know the geography, so they lost a lot of ships. They were sunk by Russian boats, captured, killed. But they persevered, fighting their way through, and that's how we got control of these valuable resources. It can't be helped. History might be written that way, and it might even seem true. But it did nothing to dispel the unease churning in his gut. He silently rubbed his stomach, which felt as hard as a sheet of plywood. His thumb tingled, as if he had touched a weak electric current. It was an unpleasant sensation. He held his thumb up to his eye level and rubbed it with his other hand. After dinner, the men gathered around the cracked, dented stove in the middle of the shithole. As they warmed themselves, steam rose from their bodies. The air was thick with the stench of crab and body odor. "I don't know why, but I don't want to die," someone said. "Me neither." A feeling of despair settled over them. They were being driven to their death. They were all filled with a diffuse, simmering anger. We're working ourselves to death for nothing, damn it." The stammering fisherman suddenly burst out, his face flushed and contorted. They fell silent for a moment, as if struck by something. "I don't want to die in Kamchatka. The supply ship left Hakodate. The radio operator told me. I want to go home. No chance. I heard people try to escape on the supply ship." "Really? Sounds good." They pretend to go fishing, then sneak ashore in Kamchatka and join the Russians, spreading their propaganda. For the good of the Empire of Japan, huh? What a convenient excuse. The student unbuttoned his shirt, revealing his bony chest, and scratched himself, yawning. Flakes of dried sweat and grime fell like mica dust. Those rich bastards are getting rich at our expense." A middle-aged fisherman with baggy eyelids and dull, watery eyes spat at the stove. The saliva sizzled and evaporated, leaving a tiny, greasy spot. The men watched with vacant stares. "That might be true," someone said, but the captain, holding up a red blanket lining made of rubber to the stove, said, Hey, don't go getting any rebellious ideas. It's our right." "Damn it," the stammering fisherman retorted, his lips puckered like an octopus. The air filled with the acrid smell of burning rubber. "Hey, old man, your rubber. Oh, it's burning." The gentle rocking of the ship indicated that the waves had subsided. The ship swayed gently. The 5-candle-power lamp cast flickering shadows on the men huddled around the stove, their shadows intertwining and merging. It was a quiet night. The red glow from the stove's opening flickered on their legs. It was a strangely peaceful night, a night that offered a brief, fleeting glimpse of their miserable lives. "Anyone got a cigarette?" "Nope. No one. None left. Damn. Hey, pass the whiskey this way, will ya?" The man holding the bottle turned it upside down. "Hey, don't waste it. Ha 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 ha. I've come to a hell of a place." The fisherman who had worked in a factory in Shibora began to talk about his experience. To the other workers from Hokkaido, it sounded like an incredibly advanced place. "If even 1/100th of what happens here happened there, they'd go on strike," he said. This sparked a conversation about their past experiences. They talked about national highway construction, irrigation projects, railroad construction, harbor construction and land reclamation, new mine development, land clearing, freight handling, herring fishing. Almost everyone had done one or more of these jobs. When workers in the mainland became worn out and unproductive, and when markets became saturated, the capitalists turned their greedy eyes towards Hokkaido and Sakhalin. There, they could exploit workers as ruthlessly as they did in the colonies of Korea and Taiwan. The capitalists knew they could get away with anything. In the labor camps for national highway construction and railroad construction, de laboris were killed as casually as flies. Those who couldn't endure the abuse and tried to escape, if caught, were tied to posts and kicked to death by horses, or torn apart by tosa dogs in the backyard. These spectacles were staged in front of the other workers. Some, even the hardened laboris, couldn't help but cover their faces at the sickening thud of bones breaking inside the victims' chests. If the victims fainted, they were revived with water, and the torture continued. Finally, they would die, their bodies tossed around like rag dolls by the powerful jaws of the Tosa dogs. Even after being thrown into a corner of the yard, their bodies would still twitch. Burning their buttocks with hot irons or beating them with clubs until they couldn't stand were daily occurrences. Sometimes, while they were eating, they would hear a sharp cry from the backyard, followed by the sickening smell of burning flesh. "I'm done, I'm done. I can't eat anymore." They would throw down their chopsticks, exchanging grim looks. Many died of beriberi, caused by overwork and malnutrition. Even in death, there was no time for proper burials, so the bodies were left lying around for days. In a dark corner of the backyard, they could see 2 feet, strangely small, sticking out from under a carelessly draped straw mat, yellowed and dull. Flies were all over his face. When I walked past, they all flew up at once. One worker, tapping his forehead, described the scene. The men were sent to work before dawn and forced to toil until their pickaxes glinted in the fading light. They envied the prisoners working in the nearby prison. The Koreans were especially mistreated, abused by the foremen, supervisors, and even by their fellow Japanese workers. A policeman from a village 4 or 5 miles away would occasionally visit, notebook in hand, to conduct an investigation. He would stay until evening or even overnight, but he never spoke to the workers. He would leave, his face flushed, staggering down the road, urinating as he walked, like a drunken fireman, muttering to himself that in Hokkaido, every railroad tie was literally the corpse of a worker, his face contorted in a grimace. Workers dying of beriberi were buried alive in the foundations of harbor construction projects, like human sacrifices. These Hokkaido laborers were called tako, octopus. An octopus will eat its own limbs to survive. It was a perfect analogy. Here, in this remote land, primitive exploitation was rampant. Profits were extracted in abundance. And this brutal exploitation was cleverly linked to the national development of resources, a perfect rationalization. For the good of the nation, workers starved and were beaten to death. It's a miracle I made it out of there alive. I'm grateful. But if I'm killed on this ship, it'll be the same. What the hell? The fisherman let out a sudden, loud laugh. Then, his face darkened, and he turned away. It was the same in the mines. When digging new tunnels, the capitalists, to determine the presence of gas or other dangers, used workers, cheaper than guinea pigs, sending them in wave after wave, like General Nogi's suicidal charges during the Russo-Japanese War. They treated them like disposable tissues. The mine shafts were reinforced with layers upon layers of workers' flesh and blood, like tuna sashimi. Taking advantage of the remote location, unspeakable atrocities were committed here as well. Sometimes, fingers and toes, severed from their owners, would be found stuck to the coal brought up by the carts. The women and children, however, were conditioned not to react. With expressionless faces, they simply pushed the coal to the next station. And this coal powered the massive machines that generated profits for the capitalists. Every miner, like a long-term prisoner, had a pale, puffy face with a dull, yellowish tinge and a vacant stare. The lack of sunlight, the coal dust, the toxic gases, the extreme temperatures and pressure took a visible toll on their bodies. If you work in the mines for 7 or 8 years, you've probably spent 4 or 5 years straight in complete darkness, without ever seeing the sun. But to the capitalists, who could easily replace workers, this was of no concern. When winter came, the workers would return to the mines. Then, there were the settler farmers. Hokkaido had immigrant farmers. Using enticing slogans like Hokkaido development, solving the population and food problem, immigration incentives, and showing movies about Japanese boys making fortunes as settlers, they lured impoverished farmers from the mainland, who were about to lose their land, and abandoned them on barren land where nothing but clay lay beneath a thin layer of topsoil. The fertile land was already marked with signs, designating ownership. Buried in the snow, unable to even afford potatoes, entire families starved to death by the following spring. This happened repeatedly. Their deaths were often only discovered when neighbors, living miles away, visited after the snow melted. Sometimes, they would find straw sticking out of the mouths of the dead, half-chewed. Those who managed to survive the starvation and spent 10 years cultivating the wasteland, finally transforming it into arable land, would then discover that the land had been legally transferred to someone else. The capitalists, the moneylenders, the banks, the aristocracy, the wealthy knew that if they lent money, or simply threw it away, the wasteland would transform into fertile land, as rich and dark as a black cat's fur, and become their property. Shrewd individuals, eager for easy profits, also flocked to Hokkaido, emulating the capitalists. The farmers were robbed from every direction. And in the end, just as they had been on the mainland, they became tenant farmers. Only then did they realize their mistake. I've been had. They had crossed the Tsugaru Strait, braving the harsh Hokkaido winter, hoping to make some money and return to their home villages. Many of the fishermen on the Cannery Boats were farmers who had been driven from their land. The freight handlers were similar to the Cannery Boat fishermen. They would be crammed into supervised boarding houses in Otaru, then shipped to the remote areas of Hokkaido or Sakhalin. One misstep, and they would be crushed under massive logs, their bodies flattened like senbei crackers. If they were struck by lumber being loaded onto the ships, their heads smashed, their bodies would be flung into the sea, lighter than fleas. In the mainland, workers, no longer willing to be silently exploited, were uniting and fighting back against the capitalists. But the colonial workers were completely isolated from this movement. Their suffering was unbearable, yet the more they struggled, the more their burden grew, like a snowball rolling downhill. What's gonna happen to us? We're gonna be killed. We all know that. They fell silent, their faces grim, their thoughts unspoken. We'll kill them first before they kill us, the stammering fisherman blurted out defiantly. The waves gently lapped against the ship's side. Somewhere above, steam escaping from a pipe hissed softly, like a boiling kettle before going to bed. The fishermen took off their filthy, sweat-stained shirts and spread them on the stove. The men huddled around the stove, holding the edges of the shirts like a kotatsu, warming them before shaking them out. When lice or bedbugs fell onto the stove, they sizzled and popped, emitting the same sickening smell as burning flesh. As the shirts heated up, lice would emerge from the seams, their tiny legs scrambling frantically. The men picked them off, the feel of their plump, greasy bodies repulsive. Some were so engorged that their mantis-like heads were clearly visible. Hey, hold the edge. A fisherman, holding one end of his fundoshi, spread it out and picked off the lice. The fishermen crushed the lice between their teeth, the popping sound echoing in the room, or squashed them between their thumbnails until their nails were stained red. Then, like children wiping their dirty hands on their clothes, they wiped their fingers on the hems of their short coats and continued the process. Even so, they couldn't sleep. All night long, they were tormented by lice, fleas, and bedbugs, emerging from every crevice. It was impossible to get rid of them completely. Standing in the dim, damp bunk room, they could feel dozens of fleas crawling up their legs. They began to feel as if their bodies were rotting, infested with maggots and flies, like decaying corpses. At first, they were allowed a hot bath every other day. They were so filthy it was unbearable. But after a week, it became every 3 days, then once a week after a month. Eventually, it was reduced to twice a month. It was to conserve water, they were told. However, the captain and supervisor enjoyed a hot bath every day. That wasn't considered wasteful. Their bodies were constantly covered in crab juice, and it was inevitable that they would be infested with lice and bedbugs. When they took off their fundoshi, black specks would fall out. The skin beneath, chafed by the waistband, was red and irritated, unbearably itchy. At night, the sound of scratching echoed through the bunk room. They could feel the tiny creatures, like little springs, crawling under their clothes, then the bite. The fishermen would twist and turn in their bunks, but it was no use. It continued until morning. Their skin became rough and scaly like psoriasis. Dead lice, someone said. Yeah, good riddance. They couldn't help but laugh, their laughter tinged with despair. Several fishermen hurried across the deck. One of them, unable to make a turn, stumbled and grabbed the railing. A carpenter, who was doing repairs on the saloon deck, stood on tiptoe and looked in the direction the fisherman had run. His eyes, watering from the cold wind, couldn't make out what was happening at first. He sniffed loudly, wiping his nose with his sleeve. A string of mucus flew off, carried by the wind. The portside winch near the stern was rattling. Everyone was out fishing, so there was no reason for it to be operating. Something was hanging from the winch, swaying in the wind. The wire cable swung back and forth in a gentle arc. What's that? Then, his heart skipped a beat. The carpenter sniffed again, wiping his nose with his arm. The mucus, thin and watery, stuck to his trousers. They're at it again, the carpenter muttered, wiping his eyes. Against the backdrop of the steely grey sea, the jutting arm of the winch and the figure of a deckhand, his body tightly bound, hanging from it, were clearly visible. He was hoisted up towards the top of the winch, then left hanging there, like a forgotten rag, for 20 minutes. Then, he was lowered. His legs twitched and writhed like a fly caught in a spiderweb. He disappeared behind the saloon. Only the taut wire, swaying like a swing, remained visible. His nose was running, the mucus dripping into his mouth. The carpenter sniffed again, then pulled a hammer from his pocket and went back to work. Suddenly, he cocked his ear and looked around. The wire rope was swaying as if someone were shaking it from below, and a dull, sickening thud echoed through the air. The deckhand's face was an unnatural color. Froth bubbled from his tightly clenched lips. When the carpenter went down to the deck, he saw the boatswain standing by the railing, urinating into the sea, a bundle of firewood tucked under his arm. He must have used that to beat him, the carpenter thought, glancing at the firewood. The wind blew the urine back onto the deck, splattering. Exhausted from days of relentless work, the fishermen were finding it increasingly difficult to wake up in the morning. The supervisor would walk around, banging an empty oil can next to their ears. He wouldn't stop until they opened their eyes and sat up. A man suffering from beriberi, his head partially raised, tried to say something. But the supervisor ignored him, continuing to bang the can. Unable to hear what he was saying, the man's mouth just opened and closed, like a goldfish gasping for air. After banging the can for a while, the supervisor yelled, "What's wrong? Get up, you lazy bums. This is a national endeavor, just like war. Work like you're willing to die, you idiots." The sick men were dragged from their bunks and forced onto the deck. The man with beriberi stumbled on the steps, his legs unsteady. He clutched the railing, supporting himself, and pulled himself up the stairs, one painful step at a time. His heart pounded with each step, a sickening thud in his chest. The supervisor and bosun were especially cruel to the sick, treating them like unwanted stepchildren. They were forced to work even when they were ill, their numb hands struggling to keep up with the pace of the crab processing. They were moved from one task to another, their legs aching from standing on the cold, damp factory floor. Their knees felt as if they would buckle beneath them. A student wiped his brow with the back of his hand stained with crab juice. He swayed, then collapsed backwards. A stack of empty cans next to him toppled over, clattering onto his body and rolling across the floor towards the machinery and cargo. His fellow students rushed to carry him back to the hatch. They ran into the supervisor, who was whistling as he descended into the factory. He glanced at them and barked, "Who said you could stop working?" "Who?" One of the students started to answer, then choked back his words. "Who, you say? Say that again, you punk." The supervisor pulled a pistol from his pocket and twirled it in his hand. Then, he suddenly threw back his head and burst into laughter, his mouth twisted into a cruel smirk. "Bring some water." A bucket of water was brought. The supervisor grabbed it and dumped it over the student's face, his body lying motionless on the floor like a log. "That should do it. Now get back to work." The next morning, when the deckhands went down to the factory, they saw the student tied to a lathe support, his head slumped forward like a chicken with a broken neck, the bony joint at the top of his spine protruding. A piece of cardboard, hanging from his chest like a child's apron, read, in the supervisor's unmistakable handwriting, "This man is a disloyal malingerer. Do not untie the ropes." The deckhands touched the student's forehead. It was colder than iron. They had been chatting amongst themselves before entering the factory. Now, they fell silent. Hearing the bosun's voice from behind, they split into two groups and went to their respective workstations. As the crab season reached its peak, the abuse intensified. Men had their teeth knocked out, spitting blood all night. Others collapsed from exhaustion, or their eyes bled, or they were slapped so hard they lost their hearing. Overwhelmed by fatigue, they became as helpless as drunks. When it was time to finish work, the supervisor would yell, "We're working till 9 tonight. You lazy bastards," speeding up only when it's time to quit. They would slowly get back to work, their bodies moving like figures in a slow-motion film. They had no energy left. Listen up. This ain't a place you can come and go as you please. And there's no guarantee we'll always have this much crab. If we stopped working just because it's been 10 or 13 hours, we'd be screwed. This is a different kind of work. Got it? On the other hand, when there's no crab to catch, you'll have plenty of time to slack off, the supervisor said to the men in the shithole. Those Russians, even if there's a mountain of fish right in front of them, they'll drop everything the moment their shift is over. That's why Russia is in such a state. Don't you dare imitate them, you Japanese men. What's he talking about, that lying bastard? Some ignored him. But most were swayed by his words, feeling a sense of pride in being Japanese. Their own brutal suffering was transformed into something heroic, a small consolation. While working on deck, they often saw a destroyer sailing south along the horizon, the Japanese flag fluttering at its stern. Overcome with emotion, the fishermen would wave their caps, tears welling up in their eyes. That's it, they thought. That's our ally. Damn it, the sight of that ship always makes me cry. They watched until the destroyer disappeared into the distance, swallowed by the mist. Returning to the shithole, exhausted, they would all, as if by prior agreement, yell "damn it." Their cries, echoing in the darkness, sounded like the growls of enraged bulls. They didn't know who they were angry at, but being crammed together in the same shithole, nearly 200 men, day after day, their thoughts, words, and actions gradually converged, slowly, like slugs crawling across the ground. Of course, there were some who lagged behind, and some older fishermen who drifted away from the group. But it happened almost imperceptibly, until one day, they realized they had formed distinct factions. One morning, as he slowly climbed the ladder, the man from the mines said, "I can't take this anymore." They had worked until nearly 10 o'clock the previous night, and their bodies ached like broken machines. He almost fell asleep while climbing the ladder, jolting awake when someone called out to him. He missed a step and tumbled forward, landing on his stomach. Before starting work, the men gathered in the factory, their faces like mud masks. "I'm gonna slack off. I can't do it anymore," the miner announced. Everyone turned to look at him, their faces grim. After a moment, someone said, "You'll get branded." "I'm not slacking off on purpose. I can't work," the miner said, rolling up his sleeve and showing his arm. "Not much left. I'm not slacking off on purpose." "All right, then." That day, the supervisor strutted around the factory like a fighting cock with its comb raised. "What's going on here? What's going on?" he yelled. But it wasn't just one or two men slacking off, it was almost everyone. He could only pace back and forth, fuming. The other fishermen and the crew had never seen him like this. The sound of crabs scuttling across the upper deck echoed through the factory. Like a clogged saw, the work piled up. But the supervisor's club was useless. After work, the men trudged back to the shithole, wiping their necks with damp towels. They looked at each other and burst out laughing. They didn't know why, but they couldn't stop laughing. This laughter spread to the crew as well. They realized they had been manipulated, pitted against the fishermen, made to look like fools. They too began to slack off. "I worked too hard yesterday, so I'm taking it easy today," someone would say at the start of work, and the others would follow suit. Taking it easy, however, simply meant working at a more manageable pace. Everyone was at their breaking point. If it came down to it, they would do what they had to. Being killed was inevitable anyway. That was the general sentiment. They simply couldn't take it anymore. Times. "Supply ship! Supply ship!" The shouts from the upper deck reached the men below. They scrambled out of their bunks, still in their work clothes. The supply ship drove the fishermen and crewmen into a frenzy, even more so than the thought of women. This ship didn't smell of salt and fish, it smelled of Hakodate. It smelled of land, the solid ground they hadn't felt beneath their feet for months, for hundreds of days. The supply ship also brought letters, shirts, underwear, and magazines. They snatched their packages with their calloused, crab-stained hands and hurried back to the shithole, where they sat cross-legged, tearing open the packages. All sorts of things spilled out, clumsily written letters from their children, dictated by their mothers, hand towels, toothbrushes, toothpicks, toilet paper, clothes, and from between these items, a wife's letter would emerge, flattened and creased. They desperately sought the scent of home from these items, the milky scent of their children, the musky scent of their wives' skin. I'm having trouble with the salted salmon. If it could be delivered with a 3-sen stamp, I'd send you a can of salted salmon. Someone bellowed the Sorrento bushy at the top of his lungs. Those who hadn't received anything shoved their hands into their pockets and wandered around aimlessly. Your wife's probably found another man while you're gone, they were teased. In a dimly lit corner, a man sat with his back to the others, his head in his hands, counting and recounting on his fingers, lost in thought. He had received a letter informing him of his child's death. The child had died 2 months earlier, and he hadn't known. The letter explained that they couldn't afford to send a telegram. The man sat there in stunned silence. On the other hand, there were those who received pictures of their newborn babies, wrinkled and red like boiled octopus. Look at this, they would exclaim, their voices cracking with laughter. They would proudly show the pictures to everyone. Look, my baby, he's finally here. Some packages contained small, thoughtful items, things only a wife would think of. These small gestures stirred something deep within them. More than anything, they wanted to go home. The supply ship also brought a film crew sent by the company. After the processed canned crab was loaded onto the supply ship, they were going to show a movie. 2 or 3 young men, dressed identically in flat caps, bow ties, and baggy trousers, arrived, carrying heavy trunks. It stinks. It stinks, they complained, taking off their jackets and whistling as they set up the screen and projector. The fishermen were drawn to these men, sensing something different about them, something that set them apart. The crew and fishermen, in a buoyant mood, helped them with the preparations. The oldest-looking man, with thick, gold-rimmed glasses, stood a little apart from the others, wiping the sweat from his neck. "Hey, mister, if you stand there, fleas will jump all over you," one of the fishermen warned. "Eek." The man jumped back as if he had stepped on a hot stove. The fisherman roared with laughter. "This is a terrible place," the man said, his voice hoarse and raspy. It turned out he was the speaker. "You wouldn't believe how much this company makes, bringing you guys all the way out here. It's incredible. 5 million yen in 6 months. 10 million a year. 10 million yen, it's easy to say, but it's an enormous amount of money. And not many companies in Japan pay their shareholders a dividend of 22.5%. They say the president is running for parliament. No complaints there. I guess you gotta be ruthless to make that kind of money." Nightfell.to celebrate the production of 10,000 cases of canned crab, sake, shochu, dried squid, simmered fish, bats, and caramels were distributed. "Come here, old man," a deckhand called out to a fisherman. "I'll give you a lap dance." "Whoa, whoa. Come over here, boy," another shouted. The banter continued for a while. Suddenly, a few men in the front row started clapping. Everyone joined in, not knowing why. The supervisor stepped in front of the white screen. He straightened his back, clasped his hands behind him, and began speaking, using formal language he never used in everyday conversation. He talked about you and I, then went on about the usual Japanese spirit and national wealth. Most of the men weren't listening. They were chewing on dried squid, their jaws working rhythmically. Stop it, someone shouted from the back. "Get outta here. We have a real speaker here. You look more like you belong with a club in your hand." The men burst into laughter, whistling and clapping. The supervisor, unable to get angry in front of everyone, flushed crimson, mumbled something inaudible, and retreated. The movie began first. There was a documentary. Images of Miyagi, Matsushima, Enoshima, and Kyoto flickered across the screen. The film kept breaking. Sometimes, images would overlap, creating a dizzying blur, then vanish, leaving the screen blank. Then came a Western and a Japanese film. The films were scratched and rained out, and the spliced sections created jerky movements. But no one cared. They were completely absorbed. When a beautiful foreign woman appeared on screen, the men whistled and snorted like pigs. The speaker stopped his narration in annoyance. The Western was an American film about the history of the American West. Settlers battled Native Americans and overcame natural disasters, pushing the railroad westward, mile by mile. Towns sprung up along the railroad, like knots tied on a string. The film depicted the hardships of the settlers, intertwined with a love story between a foreman and the company executive's daughter. The speaker's voice boomed as the final scene appeared on the screen. Thanks to the sacrifices of these young pioneers, the railroad, stretching for hundreds of miles, now snakes across the plains and through the mountains, transforming the once savage wilderness into national wealth. The film ended with the foreman, now a gentleman, embracing the executive's daughter. A short, slapstick comedy was shown between the two main features. The Japanese film told the story of a poor boy who worked his way up from selling natto and newspapers to shining shoes, then working in a factory, becoming a model worker, getting promoted, and finally becoming a wealthy tycoon. The speaker, improvising, added, "Truly, diligence is the mother of success." The deckhands applauded enthusiastically. But one of the fishermen shouted, "Bullshit. If that's true, I should be the president by now." Everyone roared with laughter. Later, the speaker confided, "The company told me to emphasize that part, to really hammer it home." The final film showed the company's factories and offices, filled with diligent workers. After the movie, the men got drunk on the celebratory sake. Having been deprived of alcohol for so long and being utterly exhausted, they quickly became intoxicated. Cigarette smoke filled the dimly lit room, thick and cloying. The men stripped off their shirts, tied cloths around their heads, sat cross-legged, their buttocks exposed, and shouted at each other. Occasionally, fights broke out. This went on past midnight. The fisherman from Hakodate, bedridden with beriberi, watched the commotion from his bunk, his pillow propped up. His friend, leaning against a nearby pillar, was picking at a piece of dried squid stuck between his teeth with a matchstick. Much later, a fisherman tumbled down the stairs into the shithole, his clothes and right hand covered in blood. "Knife! Knife! Get me a knife," he cried, crawling across the floor. "Where's that bastard Asakawa? He's not here. I'm gonna kill him." It was the fisherman who had been beaten by the supervisor. He grabbed a fire poker from next to the stove and staggered back out, his eyes wild with rage. No one tried to stop him. "See," the Hakodate fisherman said to his friend. "Fishermen aren't always mindless fools. This is gonna be good." The next morning, they discovered that the furniture in the supervisor's cabin had been smashed to pieces. Fortunately for him, the supervisor wasn't there. Vi. The sky was overcast with a soft, drizzling rain. It had been raining until the day before. The rain, the same color as the cloudy sky, fell onto the sea, creating gentle ripples. In the afternoon, a destroyer appeared. The fishermen, deckhands, and crewmen who weren't working gathered at the railing, watching the ship and chatting excitedly. It was a rare sight. A small boat was lowered from the destroyer, and several officers came aboard the Hakomaru. The captain, the factory representative, the supervisor, and the bosun were waiting at the bottom of the gangplank. As the boat approached, they exchanged salutes, and the captain led the officers up the gangplank. The supervisor, glancing up, sneered and waved his hand dismissively. "What are you looking at? Get back to work." "Look at him strutting around." Someone mimicked the supervisor's condescending gesture, and the men burst into laughter. With the supervisor and bosun gone, the men worked at a relaxed pace, singing and chatting across the machinery. "See how much work gets done when we work like this." After work, they went up on deck. As they passed the saloon, they could hear drunken voices shouting inside. A waiter emerged, his face flushed and beaded with sweat, carrying a tray full of empty beer bottles. He jerked his chin towards his trouser pocket and said, "Give me a light." A fisherman offered him a light and asked, "What are they doing in there?" "Oh, it's crazy. They're guzzling booze and talking about women's, you know. I've had to run back and forth 100 times. And when those Ministry of Agriculture officials come aboard, they get so drunk they can barely stand. What do they come here for?" The waiter shrugged, his face blank, and hurried back to the galley. The fishermen ate their dinner of bland, crumbly rice and watery miso soup with bits of seaweed floating on top. "They're stuffing their faces with fancy Western food we've never even seen, while we get this crap," someone grumbled. "Damn right." On the wall next to the tables, a notice was posted, written in clumsy characters with furigana, phonetic guides. "Those who complain about food will never become great men. Treasure every grain of rice. It is the fruit of blood and sweat. Endure hardship and suffering." Obscene graffiti, like the kind found in public restrooms, covered the blank space below the notice. After dinner, the men gathered around the stove. The conversation shifted from the destroyer to stories about their time in the army. Many of the fishermen were farmers from Akita, Amori, and Iwate, and they became engrossed in these war stories. Many of them had served in the military. They recounted their experiences, the brutality of army life now strangely nostalgic. After everyone had gone to bed, the noise from the saloon, amplified by the deck and the ship's plating, became louder. Those who woke up could hear the revelry continuing. Someone, probably a waiter, was pacing the deck, the rhythmic click of his heels echoing through the night. The party continued until dawn. The officers had apparently returned to the destroyer, but the gangplank was still lowered. Several steps were covered with vomit, a mixture of rice grains, crab meat, and brown sludge. The stench of stale alcohol was overpowering, making their stomachs churn. The destroyer, like a grey seabird with folded wings, floated motionless, barely rocking in the calm sea. It looked as if it were slumbering. A thin plume of smoke, thinner than cigarette smoke, rose from its smokestack into the still air. The supervisor and bosun didn't wake up until noon. Lazy bastards. The fishermen grumbled as they worked. In a corner of the galley, empty crab cans and beer bottles were piled high, the remnants of the officers' feast. Even the waiter, who cleaned up the mess every morning, was astounded by the sheer quantity of food and drink they consumed. Because of his work, the waiter had access to the inner workings of the ship, privy to the excesses and arrogance of the captain, supervisor, and factory representative, things the fishermen and crew could only imagine. At the same time, he also witnessed the fishermen's miserable existence. When drunk, the supervisor referred to them as pigs. The upper-class men were arrogant and ruthless, willing to do anything for profit. The fishermen and crew were being exploited mercilessly. It was unbearable to watch. Ignorance is bliss, the waiter often thought. He felt he knew what was coming, what was inevitable. Around 2 o'clock, the captain, supervisor, and factory representative, wearing their rumpled suits, boarded a motorboat, carrying several cases of canned crab, and headed for the destroyer. The fishermen and deckhands on deck watched them go, their hands never stopping their work. "What are they up to? I don't get it," someone said. "Giving away our hard work like it's nothing." But a middle-aged fisherman, missing 3 fingers on his left hand, said, "They've come all this way to protect us, so it's fine, right?" That evening, smoke began billowing from the destroyer's smokestack. Sailors bustled about on deck. About 30 minutes later, the destroyer began to move, the flag at its stern snapping in the wind. On the Cannery Boat, led by the captain, the men shouted banzai. After dinner, the waiter went down to the shithole. The men were gathered around the stove, talking. Some were standing under the dim electric light, picking lice from their shirts. Their shadows, cast against the soot-stained bulkhead, moved and stretched as they moved. I overheard the officers, the captain, and the supervisor talking. They're planning to sneak into Russian waters to fish. The destroyer will stay close by to keep watch. They seem to be making a lot of money doing this. He made a circle with his thumb and forefinger. From what I hear, they're planning to claim all this territory, Kamchatka, northern Sakhalin, for Japan. They say Japan's not just interested in China and Manchuria, but also in this area. This company is working with Mitsubishi and others to pressure the government. And if the president becomes a member of parliament, they'll push even harder. So, while the destroyer is supposedly here to protect the Cannery boats, its real purpose is to survey the area, map the waters around northern Sakhalin and the Kuril Islands, and study the weather. They're preparing for something. I think it's a secret, but they're also smuggling cannons and fuel oil to the outermost Kuril Island. I was shocked when I heard this, but apparently every war Japan has fought has been orchestrated by 2 or 3 very rich men, for their own benefit. They come up with all sorts of excuses, but they're just trying to grab territory, resources. It's dangerous. 7. The winch rattled, and a Kawasaki boat began to descend. 4 fishermen stood below, pushing the boat outwards as it came down, because the winch arm was too short to reach the water. It was dangerous work. The winch on the dilapidated ship was as unreliable as a beriberi patient's knees. Sometimes, one of the cables would slip, and the Kawasaki boat would hang precariously, tilted like a smoked herring. Fishermen standing below were often injured. That morning, it happened again. "Look out," someone shouted. A fisherman standing below was struck by the descending boat, his neck snapping. The fisherman carried him to the ship's doctor. Those who had become openly resentful of the supervisor decided to ask the doctor for a medical certificate. The supervisor was a snake in human skin, and they knew he would try to make things difficult for them. They needed the certificate as proof of their injuries. The doctor was relatively sympathetic to the fishermen and crew. "More people on this ship are injured or get sick from beatings than from work-related accidents," he had remarked in surprise. He kept a diary to document these cases, as evidence for the future. He treated the injured and sick with relative kindness. "We'd like a medical certificate," one of the fishermen said. The doctor looked surprised. "Well, about that. Just write down what happened." The fishermen were getting impatient. "I'm not supposed to write those. That's the rule on this ship. They don't want any evidence, for later." The short-tempered, stammering fisherman clicked his tongue in annoyance. "A while back, I wrote a certificate for a fisherman who had lost his hearing after being beaten by Asakawa, and it caused a huge commotion. It became permanent evidence, so Asakawa." Leaving the doctor's office, the fisherman realized that even the doctor wasn't entirely on their side. The injured fisherman miraculously survived. But for days afterwards, they could hear his moans from a dark corner of the shithole, where he lay, occasionally stumbling and falling in his weakened state. Around the time he began to recover and his moans ceased to torment them, another fisherman, bedridden with beriberi, died. He was 27. He was from Nippori, Tokyo, and had come with a group of about 10 others recruited by the same labor broker. The supervisor, however, claiming it would interfere with work, allowed only the sick and injured to hold awake. When they undressed the body to prepare it for burial, a nauseating stench filled the air. Pale, flat lice scurried across his skin. His body, covered in scales of dirt and grime, looked like a fallen tree trunk. His ribs protruded, his chest gaunt. Unable to walk due to his severe beriberi, he had apparently been forced to relieve himself where he lay. The stench of urine was overpowering. His fundoshi and shirt, stained a dark reddish-brown, crumbled like dust when they touched them. His navel was completely obscured by dirt and grime. Dried feces clung to the skin around his anus. "I don't want to die in Kamchatka," he had reportedly said before dying. But he had died alone, in Kamchatka, with no one by his side. The fisherman, imagining his final moments, wept when they went to the galley to ask for hot water for the ritual cleansing of the body. The cook said, "Poor guy. Take as much as you need. He must be filthy." On their way back, they ran into the supervisor. "Where are you going?" "To wash the body." "Don't waste the water," he said, then walked away, muttering to himself. "I've never wanted to do anything more than dump that bucket of hot water over his head," the fisherman who had fetched the water exclaimed upon returning. He trembled with rage. The supervisor kept checking on them, making his rounds. But they were determined to hold a proper wake for their comrade, even if it meant feigning sleep or stumbling around during work, even if it meant slacking off. Around 8 o'clock, after the preparations were complete, they lit incense and candles and sat before the body. The supervisor didn't show up. The captain and the ship's doctor stayed for about an hour. A fisherman who knew parts of the Buddhist sutras was asked to chant, "It's the thought that counts." The room fell silent. Someone sniffled. Then another, and another. After the chanting, each man offered incense. Then, they sat around the body in small groups, their conversation turning from the death of their comrade to their own precarious existence. After the captain and doctor left, the stammering fisherman stepped forward. "I don't know the sutras. I can't comfort Yamoda's soul with chants. But I know one thing. Yamoda didn't want to die. No, he didn't want to be killed. He was killed." The room fell silent. "So, who killed him?" "We all know the answer. I can't comfort Yamoda's soul with chants, but we can avenge him. By avenging him, we can comfort his soul. We must swear this before his spirit." The crewmen were the first to respond. "That's right." The scent of incense mingled with the stench of crab and body odor in the shithole. At 9 o'clock, the deckhands returned. Exhausted, some struggled to wake up, their bodies heavy as sacks of rice. The fishermen, too, began to drift off to sleep, one by one. The ship rocked gently, the candle flames flickering and growing brighter with each roll. The white cloth covering the dead man's face shifted, then settled. The sight was unnerving. The waves began to slap against the ship's side. The next morning, after working for a little over an hour, 4 men, chosen by the supervisor, went below. After a brief chanting of the sutras by the same fisherman from the previous night, they, along with 3 or 4 sick men, placed the body in a burlap sack. There were plenty of new sacks, but the supervisor refused to waste a new one on a corpse that was going to be thrown into the sea. They had run out of incense. Poor guy. He really didn't want to die like this, one of the men said, his voice choked with emotion, as they struggled to tie the sack. Tears fell onto the burlap. No, don't cry, tears. I wish we could take him back to Hakodate. Look at his face. He doesn't want to be thrown into the cold Kamchatka Sea. It's so lonely. Even if it's the same sea, it's Kamchatka. After September, the sea freezes over, and no ships come here. It's the edge of the world. Yeah. He wept. And only 6 or 7 of us are here, out of 300 or 400. Even in death, we're treated like dirt. They had asked for half a day off, but the supervisor refused. They had a huge crab haul, and he couldn't afford to lose any time. Don't mix personal matters with business, he had said. The supervisor poked his head down from the hatch. Are you done? Yes, they replied reluctantly. Then get him out of here. But the captain is supposed to read a eulogy. The captain? A eulogy? Don't be ridiculous. There was no time for eulogies. The deck was piled high with crabs, their claws clicking against the metal floor. The body, wrapped in burlap, was carried out and loaded onto a motorboat tied to the stern, as casually as if it were a sack of salmon or trout. Ready? Yeah. The motorboat sputtered to life, churning the water at the stern. Well then. Goodbye. It's sad, but, be strong. They spoke in hushed voices. We're counting on you, they called out to the men in the motorboat. Yeah, we know. The motorboat headed out to sea. Goodbye. They're gone. I can almost see him struggling inside that sack. He doesn't want to go. The fishermen returned from their fishing and heard about the supervisor's callous actions. The thought of their own bodies, lifeless, being tossed into the dark depths of the Kamchatka Sea sent a chill down their spines. Silently, they filed down into the shithole, their faces grim. We understand, they muttered, taking off their damp, salt-encrusted short coats. 8. The air was crisp and clear as glass. It was 2 a.m, and dawn was breaking. The Kamchatka mountain range glowed a golden purple, stretching along the horizon to the south. Small waves, each reflecting the rising sun, shimmered with a cold, early morning light. They crashed and merged, sparkling. The cries of gulls echoed through the air, their location invisible in the mist. It was a crisp, refreshing morning. The oiled canvas tarpaulins covering the cargo flapped in the wind. A fisherman, his hands tucked into the sleeves of his short coat like a muff, climbed the ladder and poked his head out of the hatch. Look, rabbits are flying. It's gonna be a storm, he shouted. Triangular waves were forming. The fisherman, experienced with the Kamchatka Sea, knew what it meant. It's dangerous. We should have the day off. An hour later, groups of 7 or 8 fishermen were gathered beneath the winch used to lower the Kawasaki boats. The boats were hanging halfway down, swaying in the wind. The fishermen stood with their shoulders hunched, looking out at the sea, talking amongst themselves. After a moment. Let's not go. Screw them. It was the spark they had been waiting for. Hey, let's pull them back up. Yeah. One fisherman looked up at the winch, his face creased with worry. But. He hesitated. One of the others, shrugging his shoulder, said, if you wanna die, go ahead. They started walking, a determined look on their faces. Are we sure about this? Someone whispered. 2 or 3 men hesitated, lagging behind. Another group of fishermen was standing under the next winch. They saw the first group approaching and understood. 4 or 5 of them waved and shouted. Let's stop. Yeah, let's stop. The 2 groups merged, their resolve strengthened. The 2 or 3 men who had hesitated, looking at the others, mumbled something, and hurried to catch up. The stammering fisherman turned around and shouted, "Don't give up." The group of fishermen, like a growing snowball, moved forward, picking up more men as they went. The students and the stammering fishermen ran back and forth, urging them on. "Stay together. That's the most important thing. We can do this. We can." A sailor, sitting cross-legged by the smokestack, mending ropes, looked up and shouted, "What's going on?" "Hey!" The fishermen waved their arms and shouted. From above, they looked like a swaying forest. "All right, let's quit." The sailors quickly gathered their ropes. "We've been waiting for this." The fishermen understood. They cheered again. "Let's go back to the shithole. Those bastards. They knew the storm was coming, and they still sent us out. They're murderers. We're not gonna let them kill us. They'll remember this." Almost every fisherman returned to the shithole. Some had reluctantly joined the others. The sick men, startled by the sudden influx of men, sat up in their bunks. They were told what was happening. Their eyes filled with tears, and they nodded vigorously. The stammering fisherman and the student descended the ladder into the engine room. It was steep and slippery, like a rope ladder, and they stumbled several times, barely managing to hold on. The air inside was thick with heat and the smell of oil. They were soon drenched in sweat. They crossed a grating above the boilers, like a furnace grate, and descended another ladder. Loud voices echoed from below. It felt like descending into a deep, dark mine shaft, a hellish abyss. "This is tough work too," the stammering fisherman said. "Why yeah, and if they drag us back up on deck and make us work, we're screwed." "Don't worry, the stokers are with us." "Yeah, don't worry." They climbed down a ladder into the boiler room. It's hot. I can't take it. We'll be smoked like herrings." "You're telling me. And this is when the boilers aren't even lit. Imagine when they are." "Yeah, you're right." "What the hell?" Near the boilers, a cloud of ash rose from a pile of coal dust, as if someone had doused it with water. Several half-naked stokers were sitting nearby, smoking and hugging their knees. In the dim light, they looked like gorillas. The entrance to the coal bunker was half open, a dark, ominous void. "Hey!" the stammering fisherman called out. "Who's there?" A voice called back, looking up. The words echoed, "Who's there? Who's there? Who's there?" The two men climbed down. When the stokers realized there were two of them, one of them shouted, "You're lost. We're on strike." "Strike? What's that?" "Not strike, strike. You did it." "Yeah. How about we keep the fires burning and head back to Hakodate? Wouldn't that be fun?" The stammering fisherman thought, "We've got them. And when we get there, we'll give those bastards a piece of our mind." Yeah. "Not yeah. Let's do it, the student said. Yeah, my bad. Let's do it. A stoker scratched his head, his hair grey with coal dust. Everyone laughed. "We want you guys to join us." "All right, we got it. Don't worry. We've been wanting to bash those bastards' heads in for a long time." The stokers were on board. The deckhands were brought to the fishermen's quarters. Within an hour, the stokers and sailors joined them. They all gathered on deck. The demands were drawn up by the stammering fisherman, the student, the Shibora fisherman, and the don't be arrogant fisherman. They decided to present them to the supervisor in person. The supervisors, realizing the fishermen were up to something, disappeared. "That's strange. Why isn't that demon showing his face? I thought he'd come out with his pistol, all fired up." Led by the stammering fisherman, the 300 men shouted "Long live the strike" 3 times in unison. "That bastard supervisor must be shaking in his boots," the student chuckled. They marched to the captain's cabin. The supervisor, pistol in hand, met the representatives. The captain, bosun, factory representative, and others were there, clearly having been in a meeting. The supervisor looked calm. "So you did it," he sneered as they entered. Outside, the 300 men were shouting and stamping their feet. "Shut up, you noisy bastards," the supervisor muttered. But he seemed unfazed by the commotion. He listened to the representatives' impassioned speeches, then glanced at the demands and the pledge signed by 300 men. "Are you sure about this?" he asked calmly, almost nonchalantly. "You bastard." The stammering fisherman suddenly exploded, his voice like a thunderclap. All right, fine. You're sure, then? His tone changed slightly. Listen. I'll give you a favorable response by tomorrow morning. But before he could finish his sentence, the Shibora fisherman knocked the pistol from his hand and punched him in the face. The supervisor staggered back, clutching his cheek. The stammering fisherman tripped him with a chair, and the supervisor fell backwards, his body hitting the table, knocking it over. Favorable response. Don't fuck with us. This is a matter of life and death. The Shibora fisherman's broad shoulders heaved. The sailors, stokers, and students restrained him. The window in the captain's cabin shattered. Suddenly, the shouts from outside grew louder, clearer. Kill him. Kill him. Throw him overboard. The captain, bosun, and factory representative huddled together in a corner, their faces pale as death. The fishermen and crew burst through the door, swarming into the cabin. The sea raged that afternoon. The storm gradually subsided towards evening. Beat up the supervisor. They had thought it was impossible. But they had done it. He hadn't even fired his pistol, the weapon he usually brandished to intimidate them. The men were elated. The representatives gathered to discuss their next move. If they didn't get a favorable response, they knew what they would do. As dusk fell, the fisherman standing watch at the hatch saw a destroyer approaching. He ran to the shithole. Damn it, one of the students exclaimed, jumping up. His face turned pale. Don't panic, the stammering fisherman said, forcing a laugh. If we explain our situation and our demands to the officers, we might get their support. It'll only help our cause. The others agreed. That's right. It's a ship of the Imperial Navy. They're on our side. No, the student shook his head, his lips trembling. He was in shock. He stammered. On our side? No. Don't be ridiculous. A warship of the Empire that isn't on the side of its citizens? That's absurd. The excitement of the destroyer's arrival drowned out his words. The destroyer's here. The destroyer's here. The men poured out of the shithole onto the deck. They shouted in unison, Banzai for the Imperial Navy. At the top of the gangplank, the representatives, the stammering fishermen, the Shibora fishermen, the don't be arrogant fishermen, the students, and the sailors and stokers faced the supervisor, his face and hands bandaged, and the captain. It was getting dark, and they couldn't see clearly, but 3 boats were lowered from the destroyer. Each boat was packed with 15 or 16 sailors, bayonets fixed on their rifles, chin straps fastened. They swarmed up the gangplank, like pirates boarding a ship, surrounding the fishermen and crew. We've been had. Those bastards. The Shibora fishermen, the sailors, and the stokers' representatives cried out. That's what you get. It was the supervisor. His strangely passive behavior during the strike finally made sense. But it was too late. Without a word, the sailors rounded up the 9 representatives, their bayonets glinting in the fading light. They were accused of being insubordinate, disloyal, and traitorous Russian sympathizers. It happened so quickly, while the others watched in stunned silence. They were as helpless as onlookers watching a piece of paper burn. It was over, just like that. We have no one but ourselves, someone said. They talk about the Imperial Navy, but they're just tools of the rich. On the side of the citizens? Bullshit. The sailors stayed on board for 3 days, as a precaution. Every night, their officers drank with the supervisor and the others in the saloon. Serves them right, they said. This time, the fishermen understood, without a doubt, who their enemy was, and how, surprisingly, they were all connected. As the fishing season neared its end, it was time to prepare the tribute of canned crab. This ritual was performed without any special ceremony. The fishermen had always resented this, seeing it as another example of the supervisor's cruelty. But this time, it was different. This is made with our blood and sweat. I hope they enjoy it. I hope they get a stomachache, one of the fishermen said, spitting on the floor. They worked with a sense of defiance. Put some rocks in it. Who cares? We have no one but ourselves. This realization sunk deep into their hearts. Just you wait. But what good was just you wait? After the strike's crushing defeat, the work became even more brutal. It was the supervisor's revenge. It went beyond the limits of human endurance. We made a mistake. We shouldn't have sent those 9 men as representatives. It was like telling them where our weak spot was. We should have all acted together. Then the supervisor wouldn't have been able to call the destroyer. They couldn't have taken us all. They need us to work. That's right. That's right. If we keep working like this, we'll all be killed. We have to slack off together, like we did before. Like the stammering guy said, we have to unite. We know what we can achieve when we work together. And if they call the destroyer again, this time we'll all surrender. That might be our only way out. Maybe. But if that happens, the supervisor will be the one who panics. The company will be furious. It'll be too late to bring in replacements from Hakodate, and the output will be negligible. If we play our cards right, we might actually pull this off. We can do it. And it's strange, but no one's scared anymore. Everyone's pissed off. To be honest, I don't care what happens. It's either do or die. Let's do it again. And so, they rose up. One more time, postscript. A few additional notes on what happened afterwards. The second, full-scale slack-off was a complete success. The stunned supervisor, unable to believe what was happening, rushed to the radio room, only to freeze at the door, paralyzed by indecision. B. The Hako Maru wasn't the only ship where slacking off and strikes occurred. Red propaganda pamphlets were found on several ships. C. After the fishing season ended and the ships returned to Hakodate, the company, citing disruptive behavior and significant impact on production, fired the supervisor and the bosun, their loyal dogs, without severance pay, a more miserable fate than the fishermen's. The irony was that the supervisor reportedly cried out, "Damn it! I've been tricked this whole time." And, armed with the profound experience of organization and struggle, the fishermen and young deckhands, upon returning to shore, infiltrated various labor sectors, spreading their message. This story is a page from the history of capitalist infiltration of the colonies. March 30, 1929.